Okay, I'm just admitting a few people who are in the lobby. So I think we've got everyone on board. We're at 38, which is a very nice turnout. Thank you, everyone. Ishmit, can you start the ball rolling for recording, please?
Yes, I have started.
Thank you
We
so much. Okay, welcome everyone to today's Tech Talk. I'm Andrew Fullen, and with me today is Eva Holmqvist from Sweden. And as you can see, it's lovely and sunny in Sweden today. And we're going to be talking about one of Eva's passions, one of her specialist subjects, and one I think which is very important for everyone involved in IT these days, which is about transparency. It's about communications and how it relates to an agile sort of world of working. Now, a few little ground rules before we get started. So please stay on mute. There will be time for questions towards the end. If you do have anything that you want to raise, please put it into the chat window and I will try and feed those through to people. We'll also be using Menti, which is a tool that will allow you to vote and respond to some of the questions that Ava's going to pose during this session. And if you haven't used it before, it's very straightforward. You type in www.menti.com and a code, which we hope will be 25514050, but that will all come up on the screen. You enter that and then you can answer the questions and we get to see how you respond to them, some of the words that you come up with, some of the preferences that you list. So we are recording today, and I think, Ava, how about a little bit of an introduction for those who don't know yet? Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Eva Holmqvist, and I worked with quality assurance and system development since the beginning of 1990. So it's a
That's a
long
long
time.
time.
Yeah, too long, I think sometimes. I've always been very interested in quality assurance and the communication within the team.
Mhm.
And I think it's very important to actually deliver value to a customer. So that's one of my, well, uh, focus areas. I want to make sure that we actually deliver the value that the users are looking for, instead of delivering something that may fulfill all requirements, but not necessarily be useful. Uh, I've worked as a consultant ever since the beginning. So I started at a product company, but after 1 year I started in a consultants firm. So more or less it's about 7 years I worked in a company directly. The
Mhm.
other times I worked as a consultant. So I worked with very different kind of businesses and different kinds of organizations. But I think it's really interesting because you learn a lot. I've been at the Society since the late 2017, so about 4 years.
About 4 years. I bet
Yeah.
it feels longer some days, though.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like it's no time at all, and sometimes it feels like it's a long time.
I can imagine. But communication's been a theme, I think, throughout your career, not just within work.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's an important issue, and I'm really interested in how people react to things and
Mhm.
what happens if the world were slightly different.
Well, because you're hiding a bit of your light there from everyone because you're actually an author as well. And
Yeah.
you've done at least one software book, but you also have done fiction as well, where you've
Yeah.
explored different themes. And communication, I think, does sort of crop into those as well. So I think it's more than just an interest, it's a bit of a passion for you.
Yeah, exactly, it is. So I've written about 10 in total science fiction and fantasy books nowadays, and a lot of short stories. So that's certainly one of my passions, because
Excellent.
that's what I spend my free time doing.
So today's topic is, transparency, it's communication, and it's in the agile setting. What we
Yeah.
want to do is start with a question. And Ishmael, could you bring up the slide, please, for the first Menti question? So if you go to www.menti.com and when it asks you for the code, put in 2551 4050. You'll get the chance to be able to answer these questions, and you won't need to re-authenticate as we go through the different questions. So Ava, do you want to read the question out for everyone, please?
What does transparency mean to you?
And it's going to be a free format thing, and I'm going to go and put my answer in as well. So let me just put in the number 2551 4050. I'm going to submit that. It gives me a chance to put in 3 words. So we're going to be very interested to see what words you all put in for this. And then I've submitted my answers.
It's always interesting to see what is similar between different people, what we think and what is different.
Mhm. So what we'll see with the word cloud is the more often a word is used, the larger it will get. Interesting to see one word, I think, is starting to look like it dominates. Well, 2
Yeah.
words really, I think, isn't it? Honesty and trust. Is
Yeah.
that what you expected?
Yeah, more or less. Honesty, I think, is a very important part of transparencies. But of course, full communication and openness is also a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But we actually don't hide anything. And of course, transparency is the basis for trust.
Mm. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I like the way that we've got, full communication, but also no secret.
Mm,
And I think respect as well, because
yeah,
respect means you've got to understand a bit about the person that you're communicating with. Do you think?
yeah. And I think that's really important because if we only communicate as we ourselves want to be communicated to, uh,
Mm.
we kind of missing because the other party will not understand us most of the time.
Yeah. So it looks like everyone sort of completed their voting. Are there any
Mm.
words that you were expecting that aren't there?
Uh, I would have thought that it would be more some that talked about that not hiding and showing everything. There are some people that are have written that, but not
Mm.
as many as I've.
Yeah, I've got to admit the yellow on pale blue text is quite hard for me to read. I think the truth one's okay and understanding. I think one is visibility, but certainly on my monitor, it's really quite faint.
That
Um,
could be.
I do quite like this as a set of statements,
Sorry,
though.
my internet. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think these are a really good place to have conversations with people, be they in a
Mm,
workplace or out of work as well. I think
mm.
that they're sort of principles to live by when it comes to communication. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's quite important to actually talk about it
Hmm.
because otherwise we have very different views of things. And but when we talk about it, we can talk about okay, what do we mean by transparency
Hmm.
and how important is honesty and respect and openness.
And sort of probably moving on to sort of like the first set question with you is,
Mm.
what do you mean when you talk about communication and transparency? What does it mean when you're sort of thinking inside your head about it?
Yeah, I think it's communications for me is not just with your team or the people that you work closest to. It's communication is with everyone you have some kind of access to. So it's stakeholders, it's other teams, it's support personnel, it's everybody around. Uh, and transparency for me is very much about honesty and not hiding anything.
Mm.
So be very clear in your communication about how the situation actually is.
Do you think if you're not transparent, it reduces the effectiveness of your communication?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, because it muddles the waters a lot.
Hmm.
And you can't take the best way forward if you don't know how the situation actually is.
Hmm.
And it's very seldom that one person have the full picture. You need the different person's view of a situation to have the full picture and make the best decisions for going forward.
And do you think that also helps to reduce the complexity of getting a message across to people?
Yeah, of course, because the more you communicate, the more you get a common language and you better understand each other.
Hmm.
If you are trying to keep different communications routes or layers, so you communicate something to some people and
Hmm.
something totally different to other people, uh, it will be very, very difficult to know how it really is. I've encountered this sometimes when talking to suppliers,
Hmm.
that they may have an internal communication that they have one timetable for when we are going to deliver things, and uh, to the customer they are communicating a totally different timetable with totally different dates, and it also always ends up with that everybody is confused on how the situation really is, both internally and with the customer. So I
So
think that's important.
it sounds like very much that it's one of the tools that we'll have available to us as quality engineering professionals to be
Mm,
able to reduce some of the risks in projects, in some of the risks of
mm.
misunderstandings. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think the more muddled communication you have, the worse quality you get.
Mm.
So it's actually transparency in communication is a part of getting a good quality product out there and be able to deliver quality.
Which is, I think leads on to sort of like our second question really, which is, why is that communication and transparency important in being able to deliver with quality and as efficiently as possible?
It's if you don't know what the situation is, you take the wrong turns.
Mhm.
So you take wrong decisions. For instance, if you don't know that the quality in a specific area is lower than it should be, you
Mhm.
can't make actions to improve it. Also, if you don't communicate with the stakeholders or the business experts enough, you don't understand their way of looking at things, and that means that you are delivering something that is actually not usable. So I think communication and transparency comes within each and every area, and if you don't have it, it lowers the quality
Mhm.
in multiple ways.
Do you have an example, perhaps from your own experience, where there's been good communication or bad communication that might sort of shed a bit more light on this?
Yeah, I worked with one big project, and this was a project where we had a quite large business process that were quite complex with very many different systems that needed to communicate
Mhm.
for it to actually, well, deliver value in the end of it. And from this, I have both good examples and bad examples.
Well, that sounds
Uh,
like the best example to have, though, isn't it? Good and bad from the same project, so you can compare and contrast.
Yeah, because in one of these systems, we had the business experts were within the teams that we worked together with those that actually worked in the business that would be using this system. And that meant that we could discuss how it would work. And when we tested, we set together, we had a lot of pair testing, both developers and testers, but also testers and business experts, so they could actually kind of dry run the business processes within using
Mhm.
the systems in very early on, and that meant that we could found the mistakes were done much earlier, but we
Hmm.
could also kind of explain the requirements in a way that developers understood. So they could actually, we prevented a lot of defects in that way
Hmm.
uh, by actually understanding the requirements better. So that's a very good example that I think highlights how
Hmm.
that communication between us and the business actually made the end product much, much better.
But I suspect there were also times when maybe it wasn't quite so transparent, maybe it wasn't quite so successful as well, but that
Yeah,
you had to sort of fix those. So can you
yeah.
give us an example where it wasn't working and then you had to sort of fix the communications?
Yeah, and I told you that in this example we had several systems that worked
Mm,
together, and they were possible to deliver the value if they didn't work together. The problem we had was that another system that we communicated a lot with, they had also business experts that were involved in the development, but they worked in another part of the business,
mm,
and those business processes didn't actually match when it comes to terms and how they thought and so on. So uh, they worked very good with business experts as well, but we discovered after a while that the different kinds of businesses didn't actually talk together. So their communication was lacking, and that meant that our team's communications between those two systems also lacked. So we had to make a, well, change up things. So, and talk about what the different terms actually meant, and talk about the total process together with the representatives from the both parts of the businesses, just to improve the
mhm.
communication. Uh, so we solved it in the end, but it caused a lot of problems before we had discovered the problem. Really.
So it's almost like when it comes to testing then, where you've got the different systems communicating and they're
Mm,
sending their messages quite happily off to the other system, and they just assume and they just trust that the other system will make sense of it and
mm,
handle it in the way that they intend it to be. And the
yeah.
receiving system's going, oh, they mean this. And you've got those assumptions built in. It's
Mm,
not really communications, it's sort of output only. And it
mm,
happens with people as well as systems.
yeah, it does. And in this case, it you had the same term, so you sent the same data. So you thought it was different kinds of data. So one
Mhm,
system thought it was one thing, and the other system that has sent it actually sent something else. But we call it the same thing. So it was hard to discover when you just talked IT personnel
mm.
to IT personnel.
Yeah, I've seen that myself where system was producing a report every day for 20 years. The
Mm.
system it was communicating to had been decommissioned for 19 years.
Yeah.
And no one had noticed that
Mm,
all of this output was going off there and it
mm,
was never being received by anybody. And it took somebody in another site who was new at the job going, why am I getting all of this network traffic? Why are we
mm.
getting all of these messages? What are you guys doing? Well, it's for your system. Never heard of it. And then they dug around and found, well, we decommissioned that in 2000. And you could see an awful lot of people going, who's going to tell the boss about this?
Yeah.
But they did actually, and it was because they were honest about it
Mm,
and they were open about it to management. Management knew that none of them had been involved in the decision, and it was just marked down as a
mm,
story to tell people as to why communication was good.
mm.
And just don't
Yeah.
assume that somebody's receiving it and understanding it.
Yeah. Exactly.
And one of the things that's changed since you started, and certainly for me as well, and with is the way the teams work,
Yeah.
because waterfall teams communicated very differently. And the third part of sort of the topic today is about the agile teams.
Yeah.
And does that communication and transparency change and affect the quality when you're in an agile team compared to a more waterfall or? fragile type team?
Yeah, it actually does. And just to be clear that when we worked with less agile system development, we just had to make uh, the communication work anyway.
Hmm.
So in that aspect, it actually isn't so much different. The difference is how you look at it, because nowadays you look at it that it's the team that is the center,
Hmm.
and you have a view that you should prevent disturbances towards the team.
Hmm.
And that can make it harder to make the communication work, because well, you're not allowed to speak to a team unless it's before the beginning of a sprint or just after the end of a sprint. And if you are going to deliver quality, you can't limit your communication with a team to just 2 weeks apart. It doesn't work like that. So you need to have communication throughout.
Hmm.
The other one aspect is that, well, the agile way of thinking of things started from the aspect of one team delivering one system.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of systems that deliver value.
Yeah.
And in those cases, which are the most uh, circumstances that I work with, you have multiple teams that actually has to work together, because the, nobody will deliver value unless everything works together. And the standard agile manifest doesn't take that dependency into account.
Hmm.
If you're working in a good way, you do, and you handle it, of course, but it can be that if you're not used to the agile way of working and just look at that team focused way, you could be that you actually are isolating the team from everything around them.
Is this where Scrum of Scrums can help, do you think?
Yes, for instance, but also the view that you actually need to work together to deliver value. So
Mm.
you need to have that overall view of what you actually are trying to achieve, instead of just looking at that tiny user story that it is the focus right now.
Mm. Do you think maybe sometimes our teams get a little bit too insular when we're in Agile and they only
Mm,
look inwards?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So moving on to our second Menti question. So if you weren't here at the start, if you type into a browser www.menti.com, and a slide will come up on the screen in a moment. Um, there's the URL. It'll ask for the code. If you've already got a window open, you just need to refresh, or it may even auto refresh for you. But it's what type of communication is hardest to keep open and honest? And I certainly have some ideas on that. So, take a little time, think about it, put your suggestions in there. You don't have to put all three boxes, but very, very quickly we'll start seeing some trends coming up here, like bad news, really bad news, very, very, very bad news. Is it possible that bad news is seen as being one of those things that
I think so. I totally agree with that.
an interesting one there, reflection, I saw for
Mhm.
a moment on there, which isn't one that I would have thought of,
No, neither do I.
but
But
it's a
negative
thoughtful one.
feedback and bad news,
Mm,
I would have also written.
yeah. And it's very tempting when you've got bad news to go into it with a preamble of, oh, well, this has happened, 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 at which point the stakeholder has died of old age or boredom. And then you go, and we've got a 3 week slip.
Mm.
I
And we
think
don't hear the last one.
exactly. I think you sometimes have to change your way of communicating on the bad news, which is we've got a 3 month slip. and then
Yeah,
explain why. You've got to get that bit of bad news, I
yeah,
think, in there really quickly.
exactly, and be very clear about it. So there's no risk that the other party
Mm,
misunderstands you.
yeah, and there's some fascinating sort of f- topics coming out on the back of this, which we could probably talk about for hours and days and weeks, but everyone else would probably get bored and accidentally disconnect if we did. I
Maybe not so accidentally.
well, exactly that. But there are some interesting ones
Mm,
because I see one there, bully, and I've seen some people that when you're trying to give an open and honest communication to them, will lash out and belittle people and do all sorts of really negative behaviors.
mm,
And that's a hard one to deal with.
yeah,
It's always one of the hardest ones.
it is. I've actually had to have one person not be allowed to be in any form of inspection meetings
Mhm.
because of the way he communicated what he
Mm.
found.
Yeah, I think most of us would be aware of cases like that
Mm,
or those sort of behaviors. What I will say is that Capgemini and Sogeti have very strong policies on supporting people in those sort of
yeah.
situations. I myself have actually availed myself of those with a client even
Mm,
where I've had to raise it internally through the CAP Sogeti processes to get the assistance that I needed to deal with it. So if
mm,
you're ever into that sort of situation, reach out to your reviewers, to your managers, and try and get the support. Our company is actually, I think, overall very good in supporting people when those things come along. So
mm.
please never suffer in silence from it. Slight aside to what we're doing on the topic of this, but I think it's an important one to mention.
Yeah, and I think also it's important because if you are suffering bullies all the time, you are actually preventing transparent communication.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So what else do you think you would have expected to see in this before, or is this what you would have expected to see?
This is much what I would have expected. Bad news is one of the largest thing that is hard to keep open and honest. And I heard uh, several very interesting way of communicating bad news that actually didn't communicate that it was bad at all.
Mm,
So in one occasion, so if I hadn't knew what the situation was and just listened to the project manager when she described the situation, I would have thought that we were on schedule with great quality and no issues whatsoever. Um, Fortunately, I knew what the situation was,
mhm,
and I couldn't keep quiet in that, so I raised some quality issues that
mhm.
people needed to be aware of. But you can be so afraid of delivering bad news that you actually not delivering them at all.
Yeah, and there's a couple of good comments that have come in from the meeting chat on the back of this. Edwin raised the one about, got to make it clear to people that you're never going to shoot the messenger of bad
Mm,
news.
yeah,
And I think I would completely agree with that one, Edwin, because it's so easy to lash out at the person bringing the news to you, and then the next time it's, why does no one tell me this?
yeah, exactly. And you can train people to be silent very quickly with lashing out when we deliver
Mm,
news that are not exactly what you expected.
yeah, and I know Todd mentioned in chat about the sort of, I will apologize for the language, but I grew up in a very sort of working class mining engineering part of the world, and we called it the shit sandwich, where you basically put bread around the bad news, so it's
Mm.
it's easier to eat for bringing bad news together. And I think the world's changing a little bit about that. It used to be the way of good news to sort of make it more palatable. And that can work on sort of like one-to-one things. But when we're having a discussion about a project or having to communicate bad news, sometimes I think the easiest way is to get straight into that and show the trust, show the
Mm.
honesty that you're not afraid to come and tell them something. And I've done it myself where I sent an email, which was a perfectly good email. It was the right email to send. I should not have sent it to the author of the email that triggered the behavior, though, because I asked for this person to be removed from the project, because anyone who said that in an email shouldn't be on the project. And it was the right thing to do, and they were
Mm,
removed, but it was still, I shouldn't have done it that way.
mm,
And I knew within a minute, so immediately I sent an email and went and sought my boss, tell him what I'd done, so that he knew straight away there was a problem.
mm,
In the scope of things, it was all fine. But you sometimes just have to be prepared to go and have that difficult conversation straight away, as opposed to, hi, boss, we got 100% of the automation run last night, and we got this. And by the way, I called one of the suppliers an idiot who should be removed from the project, and we're
mm.
on track for finishing testing today. I think that would have sounded like I was trying to sort of cover it up a bit.
Yeah, I think it's important to actually be clear of what you're thinking.
Mm,
At the same time, you need to be able to vary how you communicate, because
mm,
I had a test manager. Uh, this was a large project, so every part of the project had a single test manager, and I was responsible for total quality assurance. And she said in every meeting that the catastrophic amount of bugs and the quality was
mm,
disastrous. And she said that when it wasn't so bad. She said it when it was really, really bad,
mhm,
and he said it when it was okay. So people stopped listening to her because
mm.
they always got the same message, regardless of what the situation was. So you should deliver bad news direct and so, but you can't uh, always sound like it's bad news.
Oh, yeah, I think sometimes the tone that we use to deliver it, sometimes you do need to be a bit softer with it. I mean, it's there's no right answer. There
Mm,
are probably a whole set of right answers when it comes to the teams. I mean, there's always been challenges, I think, with being transparent in communications.
mm,
I think the challenges will always remain,
mhm.
but
I
they,
think so
they
too.
they will change a bit as well, and we just have to accept that.
Mm,
And I think it's a learning process as well, because you'll see people on projects who deliver news, and you think, well, that the client took that really well, or the client took that badly, or the team took it
mm,
well, or this person took it badly, and you
mm.
learn from those, and you start building up a toolkit. And I know
Yeah,
that over the years, I have learned how to deliver bad news in ways that I don't think I ever anticipated. Or I don't enjoy it, but because I've had the communications, I've been transparent, like you've been able to
mm,
call out, it's
mm,
easier to know how to do it and have that framework to act in.
yeah. And I think also if you have a transparent communication all the way through, it's not that kind of a shock when you have
Mm,
to deliver bad news, because it's not everything is green, everything is wonderful, and then suddenly everything is very, very bad. You have a gradual descent into the bad
yeah,
news, and that
that-
makes it easy to understand.
it's a good point as well,
Mm,
because it's uncommon to have a situation where suddenly it goes from everything's green to everything's red.
mm,
There's normally a build-up of behavior, and you can get that message across a lot sooner with a lot less
yeah,
stress to everybody. If you say, look, we're seeing a trend here that could become a problem,
yeah,
rather than saying, yeah, we spotted this trend a few months ago, it's now a problem.
yeah. And you can actually do something about it when you start noticing the trend.
Mm,
But when it's actually already in a situation that you are long behind and you're not going to be able to deliver at the schedule, you can't do anything. It's
mm,
too late. Well, you have some actions, but you have very few actions. So
yeah,
the longer you wait, the fewer actions do you have left to
yeah.
do.
And it's
Uh,
still valid in an agile environment if you're in a sprint-based thing.
Yeah.
because you may be doing continual delivery or continual change, or you may be working to a plan of features being delivered. But the sooner you tell people there's a problem in
Mm,
a sprint or across the entire duration, I think you've got more chance to fix it.
yeah, you do.
And do you think that's one of the reasons why Agile maybe is a little easier to work in for everyone?
Yeah, because you can have a greater flexibility.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's also important to kind of think about those kind of that you're not focusing solely on the team and the
Mm.
team's delivery. You need to have a full picture, and of course you need to focus sometimes, but uh, you can't just uh, block out everything outside the teams.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, but I think there are very good possibilities within agile development to actually handle these kinds of situations.
Mm. Yeah, I think so too. I suppose it also leads on to a question, what are the different groups in Agile that we do need to communicate to? Because some of them are obvious. There's the team,
Yeah,
your product
exactly.
owner,
Yeah,
and then it gets a bit blurry.
yeah. Uh, but you have the stakeholders,
Hmm.
the people that are actually taking the decisions if we are going to deliver or not deliver. The business, you need to
Hmm.
communicate with the business, and often the product owner uh, is not enough.
Hmm.
You need to communicate wider. You also have different kind of support personnel. For
Hmm.
instance, it can be that some parts of operations is handled with separate teams. You can't handle it within the team.
Yeah.
You need to communicate with those as well. You need to communicate with our teams that you have dependencies with, and the users, of course.
Mm.
Uh, so there's often a very large amount of people that you need to have communication with, and you need to adapt the communication to each of these groups. At the same time, it has to be transparent and honest,
Mm.
but they can't understand the same type of communication, so you need to adapt it so they can understand what you're actually saying. So it's not that you are hiding some
Hmm.
information for some parts, but you are explaining it in different ways, depending on what they have for background and experiences and
Do you
so
think
on.
sometimes that transparency and communications don't work together too well, and that there's times where you maybe over communicate or are too transparent?
I not I don't really think so, but uh, it can be that you communicate so much detail, so the people you are trying to communicate, they can't understand what you are actually trying to communicate.
Mm.
Uh, so it's more that you may not understand the person that you are communicating with, because you can't just shout out according to your experiences and your knowledge. You
Mm.
must put yourself in the shoes of the other and communicate in a way that they can understand, depending on what they knowledge, what they experiences, and so on.
So really, you've hit on the word there, which is empathy.
Yeah,
It's understanding the view of the other to be transparent and to communicate well.
yeah. I think that's really, really important.
Mm. Knowing what's important to them
Mm,
and what the impact of the news that you're going to be sharing with them, what you're going to be communicating with them, which could be good
yeah,
news as well as bad, because we
yeah.
we often think of communication as being bad news in these sort of settings, but the communication can be we're ahead of schedule. We have found fewer bugs than anticipated. We can go
Yeah,
live 2 weeks sooner.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's important, I think, to treat them the same,
Mm,
factual,
yeah,
giving the information in a way that they will understand and will be relevant to what's important to them.
yeah,
Because a product owner may not care if they can go live 2 weeks sooner. The stakeholder who thinks I can get 2 more weeks revenue into my bottom line this year if we go 2 weeks sooner is going to
mm,
see that very differently.
yeah, exactly.
And we've got another Menti question coming up. Again, www.menti.com if you haven't gone to it already. And it's a good one. It's do you have open and honest communication at your workplace? Now, this isn't just about the Capgemini Sogeti workplace, but client workplaces as well.
Yeah, most of us are actually spending most of our time at our clients.
I think I'm spending most of my time in this little box room. Well, that
Yeah.
I'll be honest. Are you surprised by what's coming up yet?
No, I thought that sometimes would be the most prominent,
Mm,
because often when you have a stress in an environment, it affects the communication badly.
mm. Yeah,
And you
actually,
often have the stress, at least sometimes during a project.
mm, yeah, I think absolutes are very uncommon. Um, most of the times it will be bouncing between yes and no,
Mm,
and most of the time will be in that sometimes. There will be some places that are going to be very, very difficult to communicate in, and some
mm,
where it's welcoming.
yeah.
But I've got to admit, from most of my experience, it's always in that sometimes space. So
Mm.
how do you make it work in that sometimes space? What sort of attitude can you bring as, a quality engineering person to help the sometimes move towards the yes?
Yeah, I think one of the most important part is actually courage.
Mm,
Because if you're afraid of how other people are going to react when you are communicating open and honestly, uh, you never dare to say anything. So you need to have the courage and the backbone to know that this is important, that I actually communicate the truth
mm,
and not trying to hide.
uh,
Uh, and the other part I think is very important is empathy.
mm,
You need to understand the other person's situation. So I met some test managers that say that, well, quality is bad, we can't deliver, and nothing else.
that's
Mm,
such a negative attitude as well, isn't it?
yeah. So you need to have understanding that, well, even if the quality is bad, we have to deliver because we
Mm,
have laws that demands us to deliver at a specific time, or something else that makes it
mhm,
impossible to delay the delivery. So in that case, we can say, well, uh, this part here has very bad quality, and we are very unsure about what will happen if we deliver that part. How can we work to reduce the risk of delivering this? And it can be that we actually shut off some functionality, but deliver the rest. It can be that we handle it with education and communication and manual routines and manual
mm,
processes. So I think it's important that you have that empathy so you can see that, well, things aren't black and white,
mhm.
and be trying to help solve a problem, but not hiding the problem.
Yeah. I think sometimes when you do have to communicate the news, good or bad,
Mm,
being able to answer the question that will come back is what do we do?
yeah,
If you have
exactly.
an answer that you've managed to rehearse, I
Mm,
think those conversations are easier to have with well, we could move these features out. We could do this instead.
mm,
We could delay this feature and bring this other
yeah,
feature forward, because then it's no longer just communication being one way, but you're starting a dialogue and you're building up the trust that people talked about.
yeah,
And we're always more than just people who are finding bugs or making sure things is of good quality,
mm,
because they want us there for our experience on different projects. And when something goes wrong
mm,
or unexpectedly well, what do they do next?
yeah. And I think it's important to have those kind of possible actions, and also have a uh, know a bit about what are the consequences. Okay, we
Mm,
can do that one, that one, that one. If we do that one, these are the consequences, and these are the benefits. These are the consequences of that action. And the benefits, and help trying to give enough information for the decision.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of Ava's sort of presentation before we move into the question and answers. Now, one of the things that we talked about, Ava, what seems like a lifetime ago, but it's probably only 2 or 3 weeks, was, we were talking about how in practice do you go about improving the
Mm.
communication and the transparency. And you came up with 5 rules, I think, which are really sort of
Yes.
good to sort of call out. Would you like to share those with everyone, please?
Yeah, the first one is that transparent and honest communication requires courage and compassion.
Mm,
I think that's we need to be humans in those,
yeah.
uh, and if we don't have both the courage and the compassion to understand the
Mm,
other people, we will not be able to communicate in an honest way.
yeah. Understanding how that person's going to take the news and react
Yeah,
to it.
and also what kind of situation there are, what are their options.
Yeah. It's the empathy again as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
Tying into that.
yeah, it
And then
is.
your second one?
It's tell the consequence of the facts, not just the facts.
Mm,
Because it can be hard to understand what it means. For instance, if we communicate that we haven't been able to test this functionality because we have had a blocking bug, for
mm,
instance. Well, it doesn't mean anything for a stakeholder or a product owner. So it just goes through their head and they
yeah.
don't know what to do with it. So we need to say that that means that we can have a serious bug here that can
Mm,
stop the business from performing this business process that we need to be doing or whatever it is.
good point.
Uh, so that's, I think that's important. And that of course means that we need to understand the business.
Yeah.
Otherwise we can't talk about it.
Yeah. And then your third one?
It's give the information in the correct order. So you start with the most important first, and that you also use visual aids because it's much easier to understand information if you just have verbally, but also have a visual aids that kind of helps the understanding of what you are
Mm,
trying to communicate. And we had talked about it a lot about the order of the information. So you don't
mm,
start with, well, we have found 10 blocking bugs and 15 critical bugs. You
mm,
start with how is the situation, and then you
yeah.
can explain why you say the situation is as
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. Starting with the "we're all going to die" is probably the wrong way of going into the conversation.
Probably.
And then
Uh,
you had a fourth point as well, didn't you? Uh,
yeah, bad news rot.
mm,
And uh, it's like if you have some food and it doesn't taste well. If you leave it up, yeah, on the counter and just wait, it's going to rot and it smells worse and worse, and it will
mm,
be harder and harder to actually do something about it. Bad news is the same. So as soon as you know you have bad news,
mm.
just tell them, because the longer you wait, the worse they will be and the harder it will be to do something about them.
Yeah. And sometimes if you're having to break the bad news, it's probably a good idea talking with a colleague or someone else just to make sure that they understand what you're going to say to the customer and can play
Mm,
it back to you so that your understanding's good.
yeah, exactly. So often you need to talk to several people
Mm,
and get everyone's view.
yeah. And then the final one?
The final one is when you don't know something, just say so.
Mm. But we're testers, we know everything.
Not always.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so transparent and honest communications, and to
Mm,
do that, you need the empathy, the compassion, and the courage to do it.
mm,
Telling the consequence of the facts, not just what the fact is, giving the information in the right order, and backing it up with visual aids to sort of get the message across. Because we
mm,
are, for the most part, very visually stimulated as human
yeah.
beings. The longer you hold off on the bad news, the worse it's going to smell.
Mm,
And when you don't know, be honest about it, just say so.
mm,
I think those are 5 good principles, to work on. Thank you, Ava.
Thank
So
you.
that's the end of the formal questions. So has anyone got some questions for Ava? Because I've got a pile of ones that have come in already from a few people. So yeah, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You just raised your hand there. Do you want to come off mute and actually ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, what it was almost correct how you spelled it, but
Well, please
it
correct me. Be honest. Tell me how I should pronounce it, please.
it's Yahya.
Yeah, here.
Yahya.
Yeah,
Ha.
here. Yeah, here.
Yeah.
I will
Right.
practice.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I'm really happy to have attended this uh, talk, and time went so fast because it's such an interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Uh, the other thing is that, and the way I look at this is that everything is connected to everything. When
Mm,
we are talking about communication and transparency, it depends on the person, depends on the way of communication, depends on the culture of that person, it depends on the culture
mm,
around that person, receivers, senders. So it's so deep subject that you really can. How would I say that? You have to take. You have to have so long of time to discuss these kind of things, and I don't know. But my question, actually, to go to the main part, my question: how do you see transparency and communication in different size organizations? Do you see normally that in a small size organization where the management is flat, there is more transparency and communication, or compared to the big organizations?
I
Sounds.
think it
It's a good
depends
question,
on.
isn't it?
It's a very good question. I think it's not so much depending on the size of the organization, but the culture of an organization. I worked in a project a long time ago that we were discussing a simulator that they were going to develop for us so we could develop our part. And we had a big meeting with vice president, assistant, and I told them that we, to be able to deliver in time, we needed to have that simulator ready at a specific time period. And the vice president of the other company turned to the developer and asked, are we going to make it? Do we have that time? And he said, well, yes, no problem at all. And then we left the meeting and he turned to me and said, well, we will be 3 months later. And I was shocked. So I said, well, you just told your vice president that you were going to make it. And he said, well, if I had told him that we wouldn't, I would be out of a job.
Mm.
And he
Exactly.
left the company 1 month later.
So
Uh,
he lost the job anyway, then, really.
no, I think he actually changed job before
Mm,
he was discovered that he had lied to the vice president.
mm,
Yeah, but this is exactly what I'm trying to find out. Like, is it
Uh,
normally in big companies or small companies? But depends on the culture, like you said. But
yeah.
last thing I had in mind is a question that I posted uh, on the chat. Yeah, actually, do you agree in this sense that a bad news, no matter how bad it is, when we are talking related to work, a great leader who has leadership skills can always deliver this as an opportunity for the other person to learn from instead of delivering it as a bad news.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure actually.
I think it depends, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
it's a. I think I have seen some great leaders over the years, but I don't think I've seen anyone who could deliver every piece of bad news successfully.
No.
Well,
Yeah.
at least in my experience, like in some in the beginning of my career, there was lots of things that I didn't know and had to learn from my mistakes and so on.
Mm,
And I had a good leadership person who always like found a way to cheer me up and tell me, "Hey, look at the bright
mm,
side, and it's not
Mm.
the end of the world." And
yeah,
then I got over it, and I started even doing better. So
mm,
this is what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. So we're almost at the end of time. Thank you, yeah. I will keep practicing on that one. My apologies. I'm not very good at English, let alone other languages and pronunciations. I do have one question that came in earlier, which is, do you think you have to adjust how you're transparent when it's written versus verbally?
How do you mean? Can you?
So are there some things that are easier to write down to break the bad news, or are there some that are easier to tell somebody and then do it or communicate transparently? Easier in writing, easier verbally, or
I think complex issues can be harder to actually communicate in writing. If you if you need to explain a lot of things, it can be harder to do it in writing. So it kind of depends on what it is.
it's sometimes again, isn't it? Really,
Yeah,
I,
it
I,
is.
there's very few absolutes.
Yeah, because if a complex issue means that you need to write a book to explain it,
Hmm. Like you did.
nobody will. Yeah, nobody will read it.
Oh, I'm
Uh,
sure they did.
hopefully, but you can't deliver that kind
Mm,
of bad news.
mm,
So in that case, you may need to just explain it, and
mm.
then you can deliver that big communication written to explain why it is like it is.
One big thing at a time
Yeah.
rather than 20. Right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Ava, been a pleasure as always talking to you about a subject that you've got such a deep passion and interest in. I hope everyone's found it useful. There will be another one of these next week. I can't remember what it actually is on, but they're always interesting.
Mm.
So I hope everyone has a good day. They stay safe, they look after themselves. And maybe there's a few things that you'll take away from here where you can think of how to improve the communications and the transparency, even if it's just in a small way. That maybe makes the world a little better for everybody. It makes the projects a little better. Maybe shades one of those sometimes into a yes. Maybe takes a no occasionally into a sometimes. So thank you, everyone. The recording will be available if you want to watch edited highlights, and we'll be back soon. Take care,
Yeah.
everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.